Hello Flight Simmers, and welcome back to Alpha Hotel Flight Simulator Training. In this video we'll take a look at localizer back course approaches. We'll explain what they are, how they work, and how to fly them with different types of avionics. We'll then demonstrate how to fly one in the Cessna 172 Classic with the analog or steam gauge panel. As always, if you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video, share with your friends, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell to be alerted to new content. Before we start this video, you should be familiar with the basics of instrument flying as well as the basics of flying instrument approaches. It's also a good idea to be familiar with the basics of flying localizer approaches, as back course approaches are very similar to those. You should also be familiar with the methods for descending on instrument approaches that don't have any vertical guidance. It's also a good idea to be familiar with the operation of the GNS 530 and 430, since the analog Cessna 172 is equipped with those units. We won't be using the approach functions of those units to fly this approach, but we will be using them to dial in the localizer back course and to get distance from the localizer transmitter. I'll leave links to all these videos, plus a link to the entire instrument training playlist in this video's description. I'll also mention that the Cessna 172 Classic analog or steam gauge panel is only available in the deluxe edition of the sim, so you won't be able to fly the approach in that airplane if you don't have that version of the sim. But the basic technique for flying the approach is the same for both aircraft, and we'll discuss the ways in which the avionics will behave differently. So what is a localizer back course approach? As we know from our lessons on ILS approaches and localizer approaches, localizers are a type of ground-based radio navigation aid that transmits a course to give a pilot lateral guidance so they can align with the runway centerline while flying these approaches. But every localizer transmits two courses. The front course is the course that's used to fly ILS and standalone localizer approaches, but the transmitter also transmits a course in the opposite direction called the back course that can also be used for navigation and to align with the runway for an instrument approach. But there are a few things that we need to be aware of to be able to utilize a back course properly. If you're navigating on a localizer back course using a standard VOR indicator, you're going to have what's called reverse sensing instead of normal sensing. With normal sensing, the dot in the middle of the indicator indicates your aircraft's position, and the course deviation indicator, or CDI needle, indicates your course. So if you're right of course, the needle will be off to the left, letting you know that you need to correct left to get on course, and the opposite is true if you're left of course. With reverse sensing, everything is backwards. If you're right of course, the needle will be deflected to the right, and if you're left of course, the needle will be off to the left. A lot of pilots will use the phrase, fly the needle, to remember how a back course is depicted and which way they should fly to course correct. This means you should visualize the CDI needle as your aircraft and the center of the instrument as your course. If you're flying a localizer back course using an HSI, you can get correct sensing, but you need to make sure that the CDI is set to the front course heading instead of the back course heading. This means you want to make sure that the CDI course is set to the course you see at the tail of the localizer back course feather symbol, or the reciprocal of the bold course you see on the chart. It also means that when you're flying inbound on the approach, the arrowhead of the HSI CDI will be pointed at the bottom of the HSI. So for example, let's take a look at the example approach we're going to fly today, which is the localizer back course to runway 28 into Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Identifier in the airport is Kilo Charlie Golf India. And we can see we are flying a back course here, and the approach course is 288, which is depicted up here at the top of the chart and also here on the plan view. If we look at the back of the localizer feather symbol here, we can see 108 is the reciprocal of that course, and that is the front course inbound heading. So that is what we want to put in our HSI to get correct sensing. And you can see if we do that on our mechanical HSI over here, we dial in 108. While we're flying inbound on the approach, the arrowhead of the CDI for the HSI is going to be pointed at the bottom of the HSI. It's going to look a little backwards from what we're normally used to seeing the HSI look like, but this is what an HSI should look like when it's set up properly for a back course approach. If you're using an electronic HSI on something like the G1000, it will usually set the course for you. But if you're using a mechanical HSI, you'll need to set it yourself. And regardless of which type you use, you should always double check to see that it's set to the right course. It's also worth noting that a localizer back course will get more sensitive as it gets closer to the runway, just like a front course. In fact, it's usually a little more sensitive than a front course because the transmitter is located at the approach end of the runway it's used for. So just like a localizer approach or an ILS approach, you'll need to make smaller corrections to keep on course as you get close to the runway. To utilize a localizer back course, all you need to do is tune in the associated localizer, and all the usual information you would find about the localizer will be available on the localizer back course approach charts, including the frequency and ID for the station. In addition to having the title LOC BC for the approach, the words back course in bold letters will typically appear somewhere on the plan view of the chart. On government charts, localizer back courses will be symbolized with a localizer feather with the shading on the left side versus the right side with a front course. On Jeppesen charts, back courses will have black shading in addition to being shaded on the left, be labeled as a back course, and have the front course heading at the bottom of the station information box. It's worth noting that all localizers have a back course, whether it's used for an approach or not. For the most part, this is emulated in Flight Simulator, and you can utilize back courses for things like VFR navigation if you'd like to. The only exception to this in Flight Sim is when you have an ILS approach to each end of the same runway, and the localizer for both approaches are on the same frequency. In real life, with this type of setup, the tower typically has a switch so that only the localizer for the active runway is active at any given time, so the back course would be usable. But in Flight Sim, both localizers will be on all the time, so you can't use the back courses on these runways. So for example, if we take a look at Fort Smith, Arkansas, you'll notice it has an ILS to each end of the same piece of concrete, runway 826. And if you look at the charts here, you can see that the localizer frequency for each of the runways for each approach is 11.3. So it has the same frequency for both of those runways for both of those approach. In real life, the way this works is that the tower or perhaps approach control has a switch so that if a 26 is active, they will flip the switch so that the 26 localizer is on, and you can utilize that. And you could also utilize the 26 back course for navigation if you wanted to. And the same thing is true for runway 8. If runway 8 was the active, they would flip the switch so that runway 8 is turned on and runway 26 is turned off. So you'd be able to use the back course on this side of the runway for navigation if you wanted to do that. But in Flight Sim, that is not emulated. Both of these localizers are on all the time, so you will receive the front course on each side of the runway, regardless of which side that you're on. To contrast, we'll take a look at Shreveport Regional, and you notice we have a ILS to each side of the same piece of concrete here, runway 1432. But if you look at the localizer frequencies, you'll notice that one is 10.7 and the other is 10.3. So since we don't have localizers on the frequency, we can use the back course for the runway to runway 32 that would line us up with runway 14, and we can use the back course to runway 32, or excuse me, to runway 14 that would line us up with runway 32. That will actually work in Flight Sim since these are on two different frequencies. Back course approaches are never equipped with a glide slope. In the real world, if you get any sort of glide slope indications, they're likely coming from the front course glide slope, and you should ignore them. And there's often a handy note reminding you of that in the profile view of the chart. Other than the reverse sensing aspect, localizer back course approaches are flown like any other non-precision approach without vertical guidance. You track the course until you hit the final approach fix, which can be a DME or VOR cross radial fix. You then descend your MDA or DDA, where you can transition to a visual or execute the missed approach when you reach the missed approach point or DDA. On most of these approaches, you can fly a continuous descent final approach, and that's what we'll be doing during our demonstration approach today. If you want to fly a back course approach with an autopilot, it's important to note that many autopilots have a back course tracking function to compensate for the reverse sensing. It's usually activated by a button labeled BC for back course or REV for reverse. The back course mode may not function on all aircraft or all autopilots in Flight Sim. It seems to be working now for all stock aircraft in the sim and most high-fidelity aircraft. If you run into an aircraft or an autopilot where it doesn't seem to be tracking correctly or is just acting squirrely, or the autopilot simply doesn't have a back tracking or a back course tracking mode, you can always just use heading mode to track the back course manually. But usually modes like loc, approach, nav, or LNAV will not work. Most localizer back course approaches will have minimums of around 500 feet for the ceiling and between 3/4 and 1 mile visibility depending on approach lighting, but like any other approach, it will depend on terrain and other local factors. Localizer back course approaches used to be fairly common approaches. If an airport already had a localizer installed, it was an easy way to get another relatively precise approach without installing additional equipment. With the advent of RNAV GPS approaches, many have been decommissioned in recent years, and some have been replaced with ILS approaches. As of February 2024, there are a total of 50 localizer back course approaches left in the U.S., but you can still fly many of the decommissioned procedures in Flight Sim, assuming the associated localizer is still there and assuming you can find charts for the approach. There are some navigational procedures that aren't approaches, such as departure procedures, that require you to track a localizer back course outbound or away from the runway or transmitter. And when you do this with a traditional VOR indicator, you'll get correct sensing. But there are also cases, particularly procedure turns on ILS and localizer approaches, where you need to track a localizer front course outbound, and in these cases, you'll get reverse sensing. So you need to remember, whenever you encounter these procedures and want to fly them using a traditional VOR indicator, you get correct sensing when tracking a localizer front course inbound or a localizer back course outbound, and you get reverse sensing when tracking a localizer back course inbound or a localizer front course outbound. If you're using an HSI for any of these situations, you will always get correct sensing, assuming that you set your OBS course to the front course heading. So let's conduct a demonstration flight to see how to fly a localizer back course approach. To demonstrate the approach, we'll conduct a short flight between Paducah's Barkley Regional Airport in Paducah, Kentucky. The identifier on that airport is Kilo Papa Alpha Hotel, and Cape Girardeau Regional Airport in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Identifier for that airport is Kilo Charlie Golf India. We'll plan to fly the localizer back course to runway 28 at Cape Girardeau. After we depart Paducah, we'll navigate direct to Cunningham VOR DME, which serves as an initial approach fix for this approach. We'll then navigate on the Cunningham 290-degree radial to 23.1 DME to intercept the back course at Cape Girardeau at Boots intersection and continue in on the approach. Our filed route will be Paducah Regional Airport, direct Cunningham VOR DME, direct Cape Girardeau Regional Airport. We'll file for an altitude of 4,000 for this westbound flight, which keeps us above the off-route obstruction clearance altitude and the MSA for the approach. The flight is about 42 track miles and should take about 25 minutes to fly in the Cessna 172. We'll plan to depart runway 23 at Paducah. We've checked the departure procedures there. There are numerous obstacle departure notes, but no obstacle departure procedures or non-standard takeoff minimums. So we can fly the standard diverse departure procedure of flying runway heading to 400 feet AGL, which will be 811 feet on our altimeter before we turn on course. And it won't be much of a turn, as the VOR is about 3 miles off the end of runway 23. We'll assume that the weather at Paducah is good enough for us to get back in on one of the approaches there and that we feel comfortable departing. The current weather at Cape Girardeau is calm winds, 1 statute mile visibility in mist, ceiling overcast 600, temperature 23, dew point 23, and altimeter 2992, with it forecast to remain the same for the next few hours. We'll assume that we filed an alternate for the flight and that it is a legal alternate. So let's take a look at the approach plate and do a thorough briefing on that so we know everything we need to know about the approach before we talk about specific techniques that we'll use to fly it in the 172. We'll take a look starting at the top left and then move to the bottom right. So we're looking at the correct city, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and over on the right-hand side it tells us it is the Localizer back course to runway 8 at Cape Girardeau Regional Airport. FAA identifier is going to be Charlie Golf India, which would make the ICAO identifier Kilo Charlie Golf India. Looking over at the left-hand side, it gives the information for the primary nav for the approach. It tells us it's a localizer with DME. The identifier is ICGI. And it has a frequency here, and then it has the TACAN channel, which again, we can't use that channel as civilian users, but it does let us know again that it does have DME. All that information is repeated on the plan view, surrounded by the bold box, and then we have the visualized Morse code in the box too, if we want to listen in, which we should not need to do on the G1000. We should get a digital ID. Tells us the approach course is 288, so that is our inbound course, and that is reiterated on our plan view here. But remember that what we actually want to dial in, if we're using an HSI, which we're not today, but if we were using an aircraft with an HSI, we want to dial in a course of 108, and that would give us correct sensing. With a traditional VOR indicator, it doesn't matter what we put in there with a localizer or a localizer back course, but if we had an HSI, we wouldn't want to do the reciprocal of this course, which would be 108, which is right there for us on the chart. It tells us that the runway landing length is 6,500 feet, the touchdown zone elevation is 341, and the airport elevation is 342 feet. Moving down to the notes, it does tell us that DME is required. We will have to do a little bit of a cheat with this in the Cessna 172 Classic. It will not display DME when we are receiving a localizer, so we'll have to put the ICGI into the GPS to be able to get distance indications from that. So that's how we'll get that. It tells us that it has non-standard takeoff minimums or a non-standard obstacle departure procedure or obstacle departure notes. So if we were an IFR departure out of there, we would want to take a look at the departure procedures before we leave, but we are an arrival, so that's not applicable to us. Also tells us that it has non-standard minimums for filing this as an alternate. So if we were filing this as an alternate, we'd want to take a look at that. But we are not. In the notes, it tells us that the runway 28 helicopter visibility reduction below 3/4 statute mile is not authorized. We're not a helicopter, so that does not apply to us. It tells us that the approach lighting is the omnidirectional approach lighting system, which is the flashing strobe lights that you can see from any direction. So that's the type of approach lighting system we have. And then it tells us the missed approach procedure is climb to 2400 straight ahead on the ICGI West course, which would be your front course. So we were talking earlier, you're going to get reverse sensing if you're tracking a front course outbound. Well, the missed approach for this, we need to track a front course outbound. So we need to be aware that we'll have reverse sensing while we're doing that. And then it says we'll go to Dutch locator outer marker, which is this NDB out here. And that's also at the ICGI 7.2 DME. So 7.2 DME from the localizer transmitter, and then we will hold at that point. It tells us the frequencies in the order that we're going to use them. The automated weather, Memphis is the approach control for this approach, Memphis Center. And then Cape Girardeau does have a tower. The star tells us it's part-time in real life. And it also serves as the common traffic advisory frequency, and it has pilot control lighting in real life. Again, the part-time and the pilot control lighting are not emulated in Flight Simulator. Ground controls 21.6, and Unicom, if we needed to call for fuel in the real world, is 22.95, but again, that is not emulated in Flight Simulator. Looking over at the plan view, at the top right of the plan view, it has our minimum sector altitude. This is based on being 25 nautical miles from the locator outer marker. I guess you would have to ask air traffic control how far you are from that to know if you are within 25 nautical miles or not, since it doesn't have DME, or put it in your GPS. And then the sectors are based on headings to the NDB. So 270 heading around over to 180 heading, you need to be at least 3,500 feet. And if you're any other place, you can go down to 2,500 feet. But again, this is a minimum safe altitude. This is not a procedure altitude, so you would actually, in real life, need clearance from ATC to go down to this altitude. You can't just go down there automatically. But in Flight Sim, it gives us an idea of how low we can go and still be safely clear of all obstacles. We do have the Mississippi River depicted on here, along with some oxbow lakes. Actually, I guess this is the Missouri, and this is the Mississippi over here. And then we have numerous obstacles, and they all tell us what our altimeter would read if we hit the top of them. And then the tallest obstacle is here with the biggest symbol and the biggest numbers. And you can see we have a few kind of close to the airport, but nothing that is above our minimum descent altitude. We do have that locator outer marker, which is that low-powered NDB. It tells us what frequency that is on, and we do have an NDB in this 172, so we can dial that in there and have that ready to go just in case we go missed approach. But we could also identify it with being on the front course heading outbound and being at 7.2 DME from the localizer transmitter. Again, we've got the primary nav aid box here. We talked about that already. We've got the course information here and the distances on each segment of the approach. We have several intersections that tell us a few different things that we'll look at in the plan view. We've got Kaput intersection, which is our final approach fix at 4.8 DME from Cape Girardeau. We have Wedgie intersection, which is a step down point that we need to make sure that we're at or above. And then we have Boots intersection, which is where we intercept the localizer. Out here we have Cunningham VOR, which is the initial approach fix that we're going to use, and has all the information about that VOR. And then it shows that if we hit this VOR, we can track the 290-degree radial outbound. It's 23.1 nautical miles until we get to Boots intersection. And once we are on this segment of the approach and cleared for the approach, we could go down to 2,400 feet. Also tells us that the procedure this procedure is not available for arrivals on Cunningham VOR DME radials 240 around over to 346. So 240 would be over around here, and 346 would be somewhere up around here, and we're coming in from this direction over here, so we are fine to do that procedure. And then finally, it has the note that this is a back course, just so you know that you will get reverse sensing when using a traditional VOR indicator. Looking at our airport diagram down here, it shows us that the airport elevation is 342. The touchdown zone elevation for runway 28 is 341. So that's what our altimeter would read if we're sitting on the end of runway 28 there. And then it gives us the layout of the runways and their length and width. Doesn't look like there's any displaced thresholds here. It gives us the location of the tower and the location of the beacon and how high those are. Gives us the general taxiway layout here. Shows us VASIs on runway 2 and 20. It shows us the approach lighting system for runway 10, which has a normal ILS and a normal approach lighting system over here. And then it shows us that we have the ODALs over here for runway 28 and shows us where the approach comes in from. Tells us that we have medium intensity runway lining for runways 220. In the real life, that is pilot controlled, and high intensity runway lining for runway 1028. Taking a look at our plan view, we have a restatement, a graphical restatement of our missed approach procedure. Climb ahead to 2,400 feet. Take the west course or the front course outbound on a 288 course, and then go to CG, which is Dutch locator outer marker, and hold there. It has some notes up here. It says use the ICGI DME when you're on the localizer course. And again, we'll have to cheat just a little bit on that. And disregard glide slope indications. Again, no back course will have a glide slope associated with it. So if you receive any glide slope indications, you need to ignore them. Looking at our intersections as we come in, again, we'll join the localizer at Boots intersection. That's at 13.8 DME. We'll be at 2400 on that initial approach route there, or that initial approach segment. And when we hit Boots, then we can go ahead and go down to 2,000 feet, and it's 9 nautical miles between Boots and Kaput. Kaput intersection is our final approach fix. We know from our Maltese cross, and that is at 4.8 DME from the Cape Girardeau VOR, or excuse me, the Cape Girardeau localizer back course. So that's the localizer back course transmitter we want to have in there. That's where we can start our descent to the MDA. And then it tells us that if we were to do a continuous descent final approach, the visual descent angle is going to be 3.06. So that'll help us calculate our descent rate and our cross check points, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit, and our threshold crossing height. If we do that visual descent rate is going to be 38 feet above the touchdown zone elevation. We do have a step down segment, or a step down altitude on this segment, so we can only go down to 1060 here. Again, we'll be doing a continuous descent, but we'll want to monitor and make sure that when we hit 2 DME, which is a wedgie intersection, that we don't go below 1060 at that point. Our visual descent point is at 1.4 nautical miles from Cape Girardeau back course transmitter, or from the localizer transmitter. So at that point, we'd expect to see the runway and be able to continue our normal descent. And it tells us if we get past 1.4 DME, and this is counting down, as you can see, that if we don't have the runway in sight at that point, we need to be aware that we may be too high to make a normal descent from the runway. Our missed approach point is out here at 0.5 nautical miles, or 0.5 DME on the localizer transmitter. And likely, once you get inside of that 5 nautical miles, I'm sure the course probably gets just too sensitive. That's why it's not at the approach end of the runway here. You can see also it's 0.5 nautical miles from Yizen intersection, from that missed approach point to DME to the runway threshold, but on the ground it's actually 0.7 nautical miles. I expect that's because the transmitter's somewhere out here somewhere. It's not directly on the end of the runway. So your actual DME indication would probably be 0.2 on the other side of the runway. So it would be kind of negative 2.2 DME. And looking at our minimums, we want the minimums for the straight in to runway 28, not the circling approach. We are a Category A aircraft in the Cessna 172, so this is the box we want right here. It tells us that our MDA will be 880 feet MSL, or 880 feet on our altimeter, that the visibility minimum required to shoot the approach and to land from the approach is 3/4 of a mile, and that 880 feet on our altimeter equals 539 feet height above touchdown, or HAT. So that's how high we will be above the ground when we're at that 880 feet. We, of course, will add 50 feet and use this as a derived decision altitude, or DDA. We'll talk about that here in just a little bit when we talk about the technique, how we're going to fly it in the 172. So let's go ahead and get into it and talk about the specific technique we're going to use to fly this in the Cessna 172 Classic. So again, we'll take off from Patuca and head direct to Cunningham VOR. We'll go direct to the VOR, and then we'll turn outbound on the 290-degree radial and track that outbound, and track that for 23 miles. We will probably use VOR number 1 to track direct to the VOR, and then to track it outbound for about 10 miles or so. Once we get to about 10 DME, what we'll probably do is flip over so that we have Cunningham in the number 2 VOR, and we'll put the localizer into the number 1 VOR so we can monitor for the intercept. Once we get about 13 miles away from Cunningham, that's about 10 miles from Boots, we'll assume that we get clearance for the approach. At that point, we can go ahead and descend to the 2,400, the procedure altitude on this initial approach segment, and we can maintain that until we get to Boots. We can identify Boots by being 13.8 DME from the localizer transmitter there at Cape Girardeau. We could also identify it with 23.1 DME away from Cunningham VOR, but we won't be monitoring the VOR, monitoring the DME for Cunningham at that point. because we will have switched this into the number 1 nav. We can also just identify it by the intersection of this radial and the localizer back course. Once we hit Boots intersection, we'll go ahead and descend down to 2,000 feet, and that should only take about 3 or 4 miles to do that, actually probably a little less than that. Then we'll continue at 2,000 feet until we get about 3 miles away from Kaput intersection, which is our final approach fix. And at that point, we will go ahead and configure for the approach. We can identify Kaput with being on the localizer back course at 4.8 DME. So 3 miles away from that is going to be about 7.8 DME on the localizer. And again, we're going to have to cheat on this because the Garmin 530 does not display DME for localizers. It just displays the identifier instead. So we'll put ICGI into our GPS to get our distance from that. So again, when we're 3 miles from Kaput, which will be 7.8 on our DME, or in this case on our GPS, we'll go ahead and configure. So we'll bring the power to 1800 RPM. We will hold level flight at 2,000 feet and allow the aircraft to slow. Once we're below 110 knots, which should be pretty much immediately, we'll bring the flaps to 10 degrees. Then when we are below 85 knots, we'll bring the flaps out to 30 degrees incrementally, 1 notch at a time. And then when we reach 70 knots, actually we'll want to lead this by about 5 knots, so about 75 knots, bring that power into 2200 to 2400 RPM so that you are maintaining level flight at 2,000 feet at 70 knots of indicated airspeed. Once you're stabilized in level flight at 70 knots, then you want to make your decision on what you want to do with the autopilot. I'm going to fly this approach with the autopilot on, but if you want to fly it with the autopilot off, then you could turn it off at this time if you haven't done so already. And if you're flying something like the 172 G1000 panel, you could also turn the flight director off if you were not going to use a flight director at this time. And you also want to go ahead and accomplish your before landing checklist at this time. So once we hit Kaput, which is 4.8 DME from the localizer transmitter, then we'll go ahead and start our descent. So we'll initiate a 400 foot per minute descent, in this case with the autopilot. We will reduce power to 1800 to 2000 RPMs to maintain 70 knots. We'll then cross-check our altitude with our descent with cross-check points and adjust the descent rate as needed. We'll talk a little bit about that here in just a little bit. We'll track the localizer back course with small changes in heading. Remember that we are getting reverse sensing if we're using a traditional VOR indicator, so we need to fly the needle. If the needle's off to the left, we're off to the left, and we need to correct back to the right, and vice versa. If we have an HSI, we just need to make sure that that front course heading is loaded in there, and then we get normal sensing, and we fly it just like we would a front course localizer. Once we get down to our DDA, then we'll go ahead and transition to a visual landing once the required visual cues are in sight. Or if we don't get the visual cues in sight, we'll execute the missed approach when we reach the DDA or when we reach the missed approach point. In this case, it'll be when we reach the DDA or any point prior to that we feel the approach has become unsafe. So to perform the descent on this approach, we will be using a continuous descent final approach, or CDFA. That's where we do a calculated rate of descent to track a visual descent angle rather than dropping rapidly down to our MDA or an MDA plus a buffer and then flying forward to the missed approach point. So we have a little bit of calculating to do to figure out how to do that. We need to calculate a derived decision altitude, or DDA. We need to calculate a descent rate to track the visual descent angle on the approach, or the VDA, and then we need to calculate descent cross-check points to track that VDA and tell whether or not we are high or low. Calculating the DDA is the easiest part. All we do is add 50 feet to our MDA, so our MDA is going to be 880 feet on our altimeter. 50 feet plus 880 equals 930 feet, so that is how to calculate the DDA. Next, we need to calculate our descent rate that we need to use to stay on that calculated descent path, that visual descent angle. First, we need to know our visual descent angle, which is right up here above the final approach segment. It's 3.06 degrees. And then we need to know what kind of descent rate we need to maintain a 3.06 degree glide slope at a given ground speed. So we'll come to the FAA's climb descent table, which is available at the beginning of the TERPS procedures in printed publications. You can just do an online search for it, and it's also available in a lot of flight apps such as ForeFlight. It has a descent angle of 3 degrees and 3.1 degrees, but not 3.06. So what we'll do is average between 3.0 and 3.1. That'll get us 3.05 and get us in the ballpark. It also has ground speeds of 60 knots and 90 knots, what the descent rate needs to be at that. So what we'll have to do here is average between the two, and that gives us a 75 knot ground speed, which is pretty close to what our true airspeed should be at 70 knots of indicated airspeed. So if we average all four of these numbers right here, this gives us the descent rate at 3 degrees, 3.1 degrees at 60 knots and 90 knots. So average all four of these numbers together, and you come up with a 405 foot per minute descent is what we need to stay on that visual descent angle. So the next thing we want to do is calculate our descent cross-check points. The first step in doing that is determining what this threshold crossing height is going to be as an altitude, how high or what altitude is our altimeter going to read if we cross the threshold 38 feet above the threshold. So all we need to do to figure that out is add this 38 feet to the touchdown zone elevation for that runway. The touchdown zone elevation is 341 feet. That's what our altimeter would read if we're sitting on the end of the runway there. So we add those two together, and we come up with 379 feet MSL. That's what our altimeter will read if we cross the threshold at 38 feet above the threshold if we stay on this calculated path. The next thing we need to figure out is how many feet per nautical mile are we going to be above that threshold crossing height as we move away from the runway on that 3.06 visual descent path. So again, we go to the FAA climb descent table. It has a column here for feet per nautical mile on the descent angles. Again, we're between 3.0 and 3.1, so we average these two numbers together, and that comes up with 324 feet. So for every mile we move away from the runway, we're going to be 324 feet higher above that threshold crossing altitude. The next thing we need to do is realize that the threshold is located at basically negative 0.2 DME. You'll notice up here that the missed approach point is at 0.5 DME, but that missed approach point is 0.7 miles away from the runway. And the reason for that is that the transmitter is likely not located right at the end of the runway. It's probably just a little bit beyond the runway. So that's why that discrepancy is there. And we need to realize that so that when we calculate how far we are away from the runway and what our indication will be in DME, that we take that into account. So now what we do is add that 324 feet for every mile we move away from the runway. So again, when we cross the threshold, our altimeter is going, 379 feet. That's what our altimeter is going to read as we cross the threshold if we're on the path. So for 1 nautical mile away from the runway, that's going to be 0.8 DME. Add 324 to 379. And will be 703 feet at 0.8 DME, which is 1 nautical mile away from the runway. At 2 nautical miles, 1.8 DME, add another 324 feet, that's 1027. At 3 nautical miles, that's 2.8 DME, 1351. And then at 4 nautical miles, or 3.8 DME, 1675. And then, of course, at 4.8 DME, that's the final approach fix, will be at 2,000 feet. But you'll notice if we add 324 to 1675, you come up with 1,999 feet. So that's about what you should be if you're on a 3-degree path. So that's a good point to start that descent. So what we're doing is we're coming down, we're monitoring our altitude and seeing if we're high or low. We start that 400 foot per minute descent when we get to 3.8 DME. Then we see where we are. We should be at 1675. If we're at, say, 1750, we know we're a little high and we need to increase that rate of descent. If we're at 1,600 feet, we know we're a little low and we need to decrease that rate of descent. The other thing that we need to watch out for is this crossing restriction at 2 DME. We have to be at or above 1060. That does work out with the math. It says at 1.8 DME, we should be at 1027. But if we, are getting to 2.0 DME, if we're say at 2.2 and we're at 1060, we need to level off for just a second and wait until we get beyond 2.0 DME to go below 1060. So we need to keep an eye on that as well. And if all of that is sounding really confusing to you, make sure to check out the video on instrument descents on instrument approaches that do not have vertical guidance. We talk about the two different techniques that you can use, the dive and drive and the continuous descent final approach. And then we do a deep dive into each of the techniques and talk about how to utilize them. The link for that is in this video's description. All right, so let's talk about how to set up for this flight. We are in the world map and we will work our way from top left to bottom right like we usually do. So for the aircraft selection, we will pick the Cessna 172 Skyhawk. If you want to use a classic, you want to see Cessna 172 Skyhawk. You don't want to see Cessna 172 Skyhawk G1000. You won't see this Arista Blue here unless you have this particular third-party livery that I've added on here. Liveries, you can do whatever you'd like with that. For weight and balance, we'll go with 2 full tanks and 2 170-pound passengers. You don't need to do anything with failures, and you can do whatever you would like to do with customization. We'll select the from airport, so we'll go into here and we'll enter Paducah's airport code, which is Kilo Papa Alpha Hotel, and click on that. And then you can start on runway 23 if you'd like, or you can start over at the ramp. We will pick a spot over there at the ramp. And then for flight conditions, we'll click that and go in there. We'll pick a mid-June day at noon, mostly for lighting conditions. And that is all set up. And that's all we need to do in the setup menu. So we'll go ahead and click fly and set up the weather and the avionics. Okay, so now that we are in the simulator session, we'll go ahead and click on the cloud to get the weather. And we will first make sure that the altitude calculation is set to AMSL, above mean sea level. That will set an even cloud base regardless of what the terrain is doing. Then we'll go down here into our clouds and we will set those up. We'll set the coverage to overcast 100%. Density will set to 0.5, and that will give us about a mile visibility, and that should be about what we need to get in. Density we just set. Scatter doesn't really matter what you set here. I have it set to 0. I have the top set at 10,000, and then I have the bottom set at negative 50 feet roughly, and that is roughly 1,000 feet under our derived decision altitude. That should set us breaking out about 100 feet or so above minimums. Going back to the rest of it, we have no precipitation. If you do add that in there, it is going to reduce visibility, so be aware of that. That could prevent you from getting in. We got the temperature set high enough that snow depth would be unrealistic to have that, but you can do whatever you want with that. And we don't have any lightning in there. We've got the temperature set at about 75 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level. And at this altitude, that's going to be about 23 degrees Celsius. Altimeter is set to standard. Humidity is set to 1, which setting it any higher, again, might affect your visibility. So just use caution with that. That's everything we need to do to get the weather set. And I do have that set as a pre-saved setting that I can just pull up quickly if I'd like. And you can do that by clicking on the double folder there if you want to save the weather. Now let's hop in the aircraft and get everything set up for the flight. All right, as far as setting the avionics up, over here in nav number 1, I've got 13.1, which is Cunningham VOR set up in nav number 1, so we can track the that initial approach segment outbound from Cunningham VOR, and then I have the localizer over there at Cape Girardeau 109.5 dialed into nav radio number 2. I do have it set on VLOC on both nav 1 and nav 2, so that means I'm getting good VOR data and good localizer data up here and not data from the GPS. The other thing that I've done is I've put Cunningham VOR in the active down here on number 2 nav, so I have that ready to go as well. I've also dialed in the direct course to get to the VOR from here, about a 225, actually it looks like about a 215 course from where I am right now, pretty much just a little bit right, or excuse me, a little bit left of runway heading once we get airborne. And then the bottom one I've put in the, you know, no, I haven't yet, but I will do that. I've put in the, actually I have, it's a 290-degree radial. So I've got that set up so that I don't have to twist that. And I've got some course indication as I turn over the VOR and try to intercept that course. I don't have to be fumbling around with this one. As I'm trying to intercept the course, I've already got a good course indication down here. So those two are set up. Other things that I've done, I've got my autopilot set up on runway heading and up to 4,000 feet for our westbound flight. We'll get the transponder here with the clearance. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put direct to the Cape Girardeau localizer transmitter, so that's going to be India, Charlie, Golf, India. You can see it says ILS to runway 10, and that is the correct transmitter, so I'll go ahead and hit that. And what that does is that gives us a distance. We'll put this on nav page 1, and that gives us a distance that we can use in lieu of DME for using that localizer, because when we tune in the localizer, it's going to give us the ID in the runway, and we'll get rid of this DME indication, unfortunately. So we use that as kind of a little cheat to have some distance information to know when to start down and know where our step down fix is and that sort of stuff. All right, so everything is set up as far as the avionics goes. Now we'll go ahead and call clearance and get our clearance over to Cape Girardeau. I'll also mention that I've got I'm going to set up the GPS once I get the data entered in there to where I put the top one on standby so I don't have a moving map, and then I'll put the bottom one on nav page 1 so that I get my distance down here. And that way I am not cheating by using a moving map. I think it's kind of cheating to fly raw instrument approaches while using a moving map, but I still get that distance information that I need to fly the approach. We won't be flying this in the G1000 or demonstrating flying it in the G1000, but just to show you how you would set that up on the avionics, what I've done is I've got nav1 loaded up with the Cunningham VOR with the localizer out there in Cape Girardeau in the standby, and then I have I have Cunningham VOR loaded in VOR number 2. So I've got information for all of that, and then I can flip over to monitor the back course on nav number 1 when it gets close to that time, and I can continue to monitor that I'm tracking the correct course from the VOR in nav number 2 using that bearing pointer. I do have the CDI set up to VOR number 1. I do have the bearing pointers up. The bearing pointer number 1 is selected nav 1, and bearing pointer number 2 is displaying nav number 2. And then I also have the DME up here, so I will get good DME from both the VOR and from the localizer there in Cape Girardeau to have an accurate DME. When I flip over from the VOR to the localizer out there in Cape Girardeau, you can see it automatically, well, it's not receiving it right now, so it can't do that, but it should automatically dial up that front course for me. If not, then I need to set that front course of 108 using the OBS selector, the course selector, so that I get correct sensing on this HSI. So that's how you would want to set up things for your G1000 if you want to fly this in the G1000 panel. So Paducah does have their clearance delivery combined with ground control, so we'll give ground control a call to get our clearance. We'll ask them for our clearance out to Cape Girardeau. They call back and they say, Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, cleared to Cape Girardeau as filed. Climb maintain 4,000. Departure frequency is Memphis Center 13365, squawk 5502. We call back and read all of that back, and then once we are ready, we will go ahead and call for taxi. After getting our clearance, we'll taxi out, perform our run-up, and accomplish our before takeoff checklist. We'll call Paducah Tower once we're short of the runway and let them know that we're ready for takeoff. We'll assume that they call us back and tell us Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, fly runway heading, runway 23, cleared for takeoff. We'll perform a normal takeoff from runway 23. We'll likely get handed off to Memphis Center when we climb above roughly 1,000 feet AGL. And climbing up through pattern altitude, we'd likely get handed off to Memphis Center. They call up, or we call up and tell them Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, 1,400, climbing 4,000. They call back and they say Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, radar contact, proceed direct to Cunningham VOR, resume on navigation, climb and maintain 4,000. So we do have Cunningham VOR in there. It looks like we're good and centered up. I'll go ahead and put the autopilot into nav mode so that it tracks out to the VOR. Currently we're about 2 miles from the VOR. We will probably get the flip while we're still climbing, as we still have a little over 2,000 feet to go. And then we'll turn in outbound and track that initial approach course out towards the localizer back course intercept. So we're getting close to the VOR here. I'm expecting the flip here in just a second. Don't really need the markers, so we'll turn those off. There's point 1. There's the flip. I'm going to go ahead and turn to a heading of 290. And then we will work on intercepting that course, put it back into heading mode. I'll go ahead and turn my number 1 nav over here to 290 as well. And then we can engage the nav tracking mode once we are centered up. I'm going to go to about 300 degrees. We're showing to the left, of course, a little bit. Made that turn just a little bit late. And get that course good and centered up here. All right, so the course is coming off the wall now on our 290 radial there. So we'll go ahead and intercept and track that. We're coming up on 4,000, so we'll level off at 4,000 and cruise the airplane out, and then we will be on our way on the initial approach fix. We haven't been cleared for the approach yet, so we are still going to climb up to and maintain 4,000 until we actually get clearance for the approach. I'll put a little bit more correction here, get it centered up a little quicker here. There's 105, so I'll go ahead and set my cruise RPM about 2450. Seems to work well. In the analog 172, I'll go ahead and turn back over to 290 over there. And the needle's pretty well good and centered up, so I'll go ahead and engage that nav tracking mode. So we are established on that initial approach segment, heading out to intercept the localizer back course out there at Cape Girardeau. So we'll fly this for about 10 miles or so, or until we're about 10 miles from Boots intersection. That'd be about 13 miles on the DME. I need to look at the chart to see the exact distance. And so 13.1 DME, we're 10 miles from Boots intersection, and that's where we're going to assume that we get clearance for the approach, and we'll flip over to monitoring the back course on nav 1 and continue to track the radial on nav number 2. All right, so we're about 10 miles away from Boots intersection. Memphis Center calls up and they say, Cessna 172 Alpha Hotel, you're 10 miles from Boots intersection. Maintain 4,000 until established on the approach. You're cleared for the localizer back course, runway 28, Cape Girardeau. So we read all that back and we can do a couple of things now. First of all, we are established on that initial approach segment from Cunningham VOR. It has a procedure altitude of 2,400 and it is part of the approach. So I'm going to go ahead and dial in 2,400 into my altitude select window here, and I'm going to go ahead and descend about 500 feet per minute down to that altitude. And we'll get established down there and ready for the approach. I'll bring back my power so I don't go too fast in the descent here. The other thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead, it looks like this heading is holding us good on the VOR radial out here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, let's see here, I'm going to take it and put it into heading mode so that I will track this using heading. And then I'm going to take the localizer frequency and put it up in number 1. So I've got this in here for monitoring the localizer back course. I've got this in here for monitoring my track with the VOR to make sure I stay on that radial until I intercept this back course. And then up here, it really doesn't matter what I do with the heading up here. I'm going to go ahead and put in the 288 so I remember my approach course heading, but I could put the back course heading of 108 in there to remind myself that I have reverse sensing. It's kind of up to you. It doesn't matter what you put in the OBS. Again, with a back course, just like a localizer, whatever you put in there on a traditional VOR indicator is not going to make a difference as to how this CDI behaves. You can see the back course appears to be coming off the wall now. I think it looks like it's moved about a dot off there. So we'll just continue to monitor that. And once it comes in, we'll intercept and track. And then we can engage the reverse mode, that back course tracking mode, to know that to track the course all the way in for the approach. And we do have their distance down here. We know when we get to 13.8 on this distance, we know we've arrived at Boots intersection, and we can go ahead and descend to 2000. And then when we get to 7.8, we can go ahead and configure for the approach. So I've leveled off at 2,400 feet. I'm going to go ahead, I've got an altitude hold here, so I'm going to go ahead and dial 2,000 feet into the altitude pre-select, so that way when I get to 13.8 DME, then I can go ahead and descend down to 2,000. As you can see, the localizer back course is starting to center up here. And in fact, it looks like it is in the center now, so I'll go ahead and turn to that heading of 288 or so to track it, and I will go ahead and engage the reverse tracking mode, the back course tracking mode, so that it will keep the center. And remember, if the needle goes off to the right, I'm off to the right. I need to correct back to the left, and vice versa if it's backwards. There's 13.8 miles. That means we are at Boots intersection, so I will go ahead and start a descent, another 500 foot per minute descent or so, down to the procedure altitude for this intermediate segment of 2,000 feet. And then we're just waiting to get to 7.8 miles, and that's where we will configure for the approach. All right, since I'm level at 2,000 here, I'm going to go ahead and dial 900 into my altitude pre-select. Again, I've got a good altitude here. Hold there. That is above my MDA, but below my DDA. But I like that as a altitude to load in there because the autopilot won't try to level off. There's 7.8 DME, so it's time to configure. I'll bring the power back to 1,800 or so RPMs. We're below 110 knots, so we'll bring out that first notch of flaps. We'll wait for 85, and then we will bring out the next notch of flaps. There's 85. There's our second notch of flaps. There's our third notch of flaps. 75, I'll bring the power back in to about 2,200 to 2,400 RPM. Again, I want to maintain level flight at 70 knots at 2,000 feet until I hit that 4.8 DME marker. Looks like I'm going to need about 2,400 to get back on speed here. And once I'm back on speed, I can probably go down to 2,300 or so. At this point, I'd go ahead and get my before landing check complete. They would likely hand us over to tower, so we'll go ahead and flip over there. You'd want to get your ground control frequency in on standby there, and we'll assume that Cape Girardeau tower issues us clearance to land. So all of that is done. Now all we need to worry about is tracking the back course, and then we get to 4.8 DME. We'll go ahead and start our descent, and we will do our cross-tracking to make sure we're on the vertical path. All right, so there is 4.8, so I will go ahead and hit the altitude key, go to 400 feet per minute, bring the RPMs back to 2,000 to 1,800 RPMs to keep it at about 70 knots as we come down. We're doing a good job of tracking that back course, or at least the autopilot is, and now we're looking for our cross-check points. So the first cross-check point is going to be at 3.8 DME, and we're looking for an altitude of about 1675 when we get there. A little bit high on the power, a little bit fast on the speed, so I'll correct with that. There's 3.8, I'm about 1720, a little bit high, but not so high that I want to do anything about it. So I will just leave it alone and let it continue to track. Next point we're looking for is 2.8 DME, and that'll be 1351. Looks like 2,000 RPMs exactly is holding it right on speed. I let it drop just a little bit under that, it starts to get under speed. There's 2.8, I'm at 1,400 feet. I wanted 1351, that's only about 50 feet high. I'm okay with that. So we'll continue down at 400 feet per minute. Always better just a little too high than a little too low. Next thing we're looking at is 2.0 DME. Need to make sure that we're above 1060. That's our step down fix. Pull back, oops, you pull back on the panel here so you can see the chart. We're going to see our cross fixes here. So there's 2.0 and I'm at 1,200 feet, so that's good. Now I'm looking for 1.8 DME, should be about 1027. There's 1.8, 1,100 feet. That's looking good. Just a little bit high, but again, I'm okay with just being a little bit high. We're only about 70 feet high right now. DDA was 930. There's 1,000 feet. Let's go ahead and take a look outside. And there's our approach lights, and I can actually see the runway threshold. So we are good to go to transition to a visual. So that is how a localizer back course works. You can see I'm drifting just a little bit to the left of the runway right now, and you can see the needle is drifting left as well, so I need to fly right. I need to fly that needle. Just a little bit high, as we kind of expected from our cross-check points, but it's a fairly straightforward approach to fly once you master understanding how that reverse sensing works. Works just like a localizer once you understand that. So to determine when you should consider yourself proficient at these approaches, you want to use the Airman Certification Standards for the instrument airplane rating. It is Area of Operation 6, Instrument Approaches, Task A, Non-Precision Approaches, and it's pretty much the same standards we use for every other non-precision approach as well. And just like the other approaches, it has standards for prior to the final approach segment and the final approach segment itself. So prior to the final approach, you're expected to be able to maintain your altitude plus or minus 100 feet, maintain your heading plus or minus 10 degrees, maintain your airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, and accurately track radials, courses, and bearings. For the purposes of this approach, that means just not allowing anything to go full-scale deflection other than, of course, when you're passing over the top of the VOR. For the final approach segment, from the final approach fix to the derived decision altitude, the standards that apply there are that you maintain a stabilized approach, no excessive rate of descent or excessive airspeed, allow no more than a 3/4 scale deflection of the lateral course guidance, so that back course needle needs to stay in the center and deviate no more than a 3/4 scale deflection on that CDI. Maintain your approach airspeed plus or minus 10 knots, and then immediately initiate the missed approach when you arrive at derived decision altitude if you don't have anything in sight, or transition to a visual approach using a normal rate of descent and normal maneuvers if you do have the airfield in sight. That concludes this video. Hopefully it's given you the knowledge and skills you need to confidently fly localizer back course approaches on your own. Again, if you've enjoyed the content, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.